It's like he's saying, but who is my neighbor? I'm already loving my neighbor. Maybe when I was living on that street, remember that I just told you about, maybe I justified myself by, well, my neighbors are the people who come to the church I go to. Or they're the co-workers that I spend time with. And you know what? There's probably elements of truth in that. But I was ignoring my actual physical neighbors. And it wasn't, there's a reason that God chose to use that word, neighbor. And so I chose my neighbors, I spiritualized it, and I said, my coworkers and the people at church and the people I reach out to at church especially, right? God, affirm me in this. And that's what this guy wants as well. In reply, Jesus said, a story. By the way, I just discovered Jesus loves fiction. He tells stories to get the point across. A man was going down from Jericho to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Jericho. And there's an implication here that he's probably a Jew, like the expert in the law, like the man who knew the Bible really well. When he fell into the hands of robbers, so the guy's walking down, and then some robbers start beating him up. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest. What's a synonym for a priest? How about this? A guy who knew the Bible really well. A guy who knew the Bible really well happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, another guy who knew the Bible really well, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, now let's pause here. What's a Samaritan? Jesus chose a Samaritan. I wonder if the crowd cringed as he said this. The Samaritans were despised people. They were despised because they were viewed as a mixed breed, to use a negative word. They were despised because they had Jewish blood, but they had mixed with non-Jews, and so the Jews despised and hated them and looked down on them. Is there anyone in your life, I know there are in mine sadly, who I still disdain? God chose, Jesus chose here to talk about someone like this. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Jesus speaking, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. The question the guy who knew the Bible really well asked Jesus was actually a pretty good one. It would have been much better if it was well motivated, but it was a pretty good question. Who is my neighbor? But there is a better question to ask. I don't know if you noticed, but Jesus did 2 huge flips in answering this question, who is my neighbor? The first was that he chose not to make this guy who knew the Bible really well, or someone like him, the star of the story. He chose not to do that. In fact, he chose to make the guy who knew the Bible really well be the one who was stripped and lying at the side of the road. And he chose to make the despised man show mercy on the man who despised him. And the Samaritan, sometimes known as the Good Samaritan, is, if there's any human's star of this story, it's him. That's the first flip. The second flip is this. The man asked a self-centered question, actually. And when we ask questions like this, we need to ask ourselves if we're seeing everything from our perspective. He said, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Jesus answered the question, but he flipped it. He asked this question. Which of these three men do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? It's not who is my neighbor, but who was a neighbor. There's a better question, and it's this. Who will I be a neighbor to? See, if this man who knew the Bible really well had gone to Jesus with this question and well motivated, that would have been a wonderful thing. And that's what we need to do. Instead of saying, can't you just affirm me and the neighbors I'm loving and the people I've decided to call my neighbors? But instead we should say, God, I'm broken before you. I can't do it on my own. Who is my neighbor? Who have I excluded, and who should I be a neighbor to, and can you help me to do this? In this passage, who was this good man, the Good Samaritan, a neighbor to? Now again, Jesus chose carefully. It's amazing, his wisdom. The kind of neighbor this man would be a neighbor to. It's someone intimidating. Imagine you're walking down the road and there's a guy half dead. It's a bit intimidating, don't you think? Especially if you're a girl, right? Because he might be pretending, there might be some people hiding behind the bushes. It's intimidating, right? It's dangerous. And in some cases, this guy is not looking good. We might make judgments and say, well, he must have done something really bad to deserve this. He mixed with the wrong crowd. It's his own fault. And so he's unhygienic and unpleasant. And this reminds me of a guy named Roger. I don't know about you, but I can't work in a small room very long. I get claustrophobic. And so for the past 8 years, through my studies and through various businesses I've run and different things, my favorite place to work in all of Toronto is the Toronto Reference Library. Has anyone been there? It is awesome. It's bright, and the ceiling is higher than this one, and there's skylights, and there are people everywhere, but they don't bother you, and there are plants, and there are books. It's like heaven. So I've been working at the Toronto Reference Library for 8 years, and for year after year, I walked by Roger. Roger is a small, little man. He's very thin. He's a homeless person who panhandles every day on the street there. And maybe this is something you can relate to. But I didn't like to make eye contact with him. Because if I did, there would be a personal connection, and then I'd have to give him something. Right? So I would do what this guy who knew the Bible really well did, and kind of pretend I was really busy. Or something along those lines so that I didn't have to connect with him. And besides, if I gave him money, what would he do with it? It's obvious he has a problem with alcohol, and it's obvious that if I gave him money, he would spend it on that. Furthermore, if all of us give money to these people, they're going to keep staying on the streets, and they're going to be dependent on us, and it's just not a good situation. I don't want to feed into that, so I'm going to walk by, okay? I have other ministries. And so I walked by Roger year after year. One day I was visiting my friend Emily, who works at Sanctuary, just south of Yonge and Bloor. It's a church that focuses on homeless people. And Emily has a wonderful heart. And one day she said to me, do you want to come with me? I'm going up to help a friend. And so I followed her. I walked with her, and I noticed as we were walking, we were getting closer and closer to the Toronto Reference Library. And just before we got there, she got down in front of Roger. She lifted up his sleeves and put ointment on his wounded arms. And his face lit up. And he said, "Emily, it's so good to see you." And she obviously loved seeing him as well. And I was standing and probably doing this or something. And she said, "Nigel, I want you to meet Roger." And that day, after walking by him for years, after having put him in a box of, if I give him money, he's going to spend it in the wrong way, that day, Roger became a person. And I met Roger, and it began a friendship. That was maybe 1 or 2 years ago. And now when I go to the Toronto Reference Library, one of my favorite parts of the day, honestly, and I'll tell you why in a moment, is to stop and talk to Roger. I don't know why, and this is why I love talking to Roger. But when I get down and talk to Roger, and instead of thinking I'm amazing and, oh wow, look at me, I'm helping a homeless person, I experience God's presence when I'm with Roger in a way that I rarely do with anyone else. When I'm with Roger, sometimes I go to him when I have high stress levels. Even though he talks about, oh, I'm angry at whoever and whatever and stuff, my stress levels go down and the peace of God fills me when I'm with Roger. I've been discovering God by knowing Roger. This past week, just a few days ago on Thursday, I sat down next to Roger and I said, "Roger, remember how you were going to come and see my garden?" And I don't know if that was doing it for him. "Roger, do you want to come home and have a home-cooked meal with us tonight?" And this time, for the first time after many attempts, he said yes. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. I said, "Okay, Roger, I've got a bit of work to do, so I'm going to come back in half an hour, and then we're going to go, okay?" And I knew this was a bit risky, but I did it anyway. Maybe I was like the traveler who was in too much of a hurry. Maybe I should have done it then. But when I came back, Roger was gone.